Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com. And the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Subscriptions available at bakerstreetjournal.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 146. Revision, my dear Watson.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, class, we're glad you joined us today here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm the classless Burt Wolder.
You're the classic Burt Wolder. And to you, I say, salve, discipuli. Well, that would mean there's more than one of you, okay? So, salvete discipuli is the plural. So it'd be salve discipula. Discipulus. I don't know. My Latin is a trifle rusty.
Discipulus, discipula. I love those old folk tunes.
I think it's time to say wale. All around. Oh, well, we've got a delightful show with you here today. We have a guest on who has delighted you in the past here on the show, whether you know it or not. We will be talking to him about how he got started and, more importantly, the topic of one of the papers that he gave just very recently at A Scintillation of Scions in Maryland. So stick around for that. Before we get to that, we do have to remind you that later in the show, it's your opportunity to win a Sherlockian prize. You don't have to do anything other than answer the question and send it in to us. So stay tuned for canonical couplets after the interview. Meanwhile, if you'd like to check out the notes to this show, it's available at ihose.co/ihose146. That's ihose.co/ihose146, all lowercase. You can reach us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We are I Hear of Sherlock in all of those places. And you can find the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere website at simply ihearofsherlock.com. We welcome your emails, your comments, your feedback, any way you want to get in touch with us. Love to hear from you. Email, of course, is comment@ihearofsherlock.com. Whew.
Well, it's been a great show. Thanks.
Yeah. Next time I'm going to do that all in one breath. I'll try my best. Well, take a deep breath, folks. It's time to swim over or train down to our friends in Wessex.
Here in the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, we are celebrating the birth of Edward, the Black Prince, on June 15, 1330. He defeated the evil French at the Battle of Crécy, where he slew the King of Bohemia and won the heraldic badge of the Prince of Wales. But you don't need to slay a monarch to get your copy of One Fixed Point in a Changing Age, a new generation on Sherlock Holmes from our Wessex Press. These essays by a new generation of enthusiasts embrace modern-day revelations of Sherlock Holmes with an introduction by Laurie R. King and available right now from our wessexpress.com. let me read the oft-read tale again, the story of that Oxford scholar poor, of pregnant parts and quick inventive brain. Enjoy these oft-read tales anew, thanks to a new book from the Wessex Press. Choose yours today.
Ah, those happy, bucolic people.
It must be nice to live there, huh?
Yeah,
Gotta get over there
absolutely.
sometime.
Connected with our pagan forebears and the great origin story of mankind and a terrific agrarian society.
Yeah. I need more agrarian in my diet, I think. Nick Martorelli spent a decade as a professional actor before switching to a career in book publishing, where he's now an audiobook producer with Penguin Random House. As headmaster of Priory Scholars in New York City, he leads story discussions that have become the hallmark of each meeting. And if you've been out and about, you've seen him probably speak at meetings of groups like the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, the Sons of the Copper Beeches, the Epilogues of Sherlock Holmes, and most recently at Scintillation of Scions. He received his BSI investiture, 17 Steps, in 2018. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. It is very exciting to be here.
You know, I feel like you've been with us before.
No, this is my first time on I Hear of Sherlock, except unless you count those quizzes that I wrote for you guys.
Well, we'll get into that in a little bit because you've been part of the spirit, part of the soul here at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere for a while. But why don't we start where we start with all of our guests, and you tell us about where you first met Sherlock Holmes.
Sure. I think I was in 7th grade, and we had read a short story as part of English class. I don't remember which one it was, but it was probably either the Red-Headed League or the Speckled Band. And that was a year where I was feeling not particularly challenged by my school and I was feeling a little bit ahead of everybody else. And my mother is a former school teacher. So I came home talking about this short story I'd read. And she said, well, you know, there are more of them. And I said, what? So she took me out and we bought the first volume of the complete Sherlock Holmes. This is the 2-volume mass market paperback with the brown covers. And she bought me the first book and told me that she would buy me the second book when I finished this one if I came up with a list of 20 vocabulary words from the book as I was reading it. Then looked them up in the dictionary, used them in sentences, and gave it to her like it was a homework assignment. And if I didn't want to do that, I could buy the second book with my allowance money.
Aha.
And you'd better believe that I found 20 vocabulary words, looked them up in the dictionary, wrote new sentences with them, and got the second book. And it's been no looking back from then.
Wow. Now,
Was your mother an English teacher?
She taught like 2nd grade through 8th grade. So that in the Catholic school. So that section of teaching where it's a little bit of teaching of everything. But so English was definitely included, but she knew how to inspire passion in me and in my sister. Star Trek was very much the same thing. I remember the crew of The Next Generation was on a cereal box right before the show premiered. And my parents sat down and they said, we loved the original one. We think you'll like this one as much as we did. And so Star Trek The Next Generation became family appointment viewing from the pilot on.
How much cereal did you have to
Thankfully, I only remember the one box. I don't know if that is true. I'll be honest. That is how I remember it being, but I know for a fact that my parents were like, we like this. We think you'll like it. The same thing with, James Bond films. The same thing with the television show MacGyver.
Oh, that's great.
Every one of them, they sat me down. And it was like, I got to stay up half an hour past my bedtime to watch MacGyver. And that was cool.
Wow. Well, you know, my parents like drinking and, no, that's not.
Did they teach it to you?
It's, well, they passed it down as part of the oral tradition in our family. So.
They passed out down. Yeah.
Well, how fortunate you were to have a mom like that who was not only keenly aware of certain cultural zeitgeists, be they televised or literary, but who knew how to inspire you and your sister to want to do more.
Oh, yeah, very much. Like, there were the things that I found somewhere in there on my own, but the major things I have are my parents sitting me down. Major memories I have are my parents sitting me down and saying, we think you'll like this. And they were always right.
Do you happen to remember any of the words that stood out when you read that first volume?
You know, I do. One of them was pince nez, which forever I had said pince nez.
Well, it's not pince nez?
I don't know. Assizes was another one. And I know that
a size is how large your suit is, right?
that usage as well. But of course, referring to the courts, which was actually, I remember looking that one up being hard because it wasn't in the standard American dictionary. So I actually had to go find a much more comprehensive dictionary before the internet was a thing. And then words that related to Victorian London, like hansom cab or things like that, that now feel so familiar and so everyday usage. But thinking back, it's like, right, I had to go look up, what a gasogene was.
So the curiosity, the innate curiosity that comes along with that. I mean, obviously it took an effort. And there are certain kids who, given the choice, do this assignment or spend your allowance money. There's certain kids who would have been motivated to just earn a little bit more money, go out and buy the book themselves and not do the assignment. But your willingness to play along, for one, but also the kind of self-motivation there as well, the curiosity and the own self-motivating incentive there. That, to me, ties directly in with a later iteration of your Sherlockian career, if we may, and that is Quizmaster.
Yes, I think there's a line there between the two of them.
Do you remember taking your first Sherlockian quiz? And where was it?
So my first Sherlockian quiz was at my first Sherlockian meeting, which was the Sons of the Copper Beeches in Philadelphia.
Okay.
It was about, 2007 or so, give or take. And I remember the quiz was on the illustrious client. I remember I did terribly because I had read it, only once, in preparation, and was completely unused to the level of detail that would be asked in a Sherlockian quiz.
Do you remember who wrote the quiz for the Sons that year?
That I have no memory of.
Okay. Because there's some quizmasters out there, as you well know, who are ruthless in nature. There are others who are more forgiving and try to make it a groupthink exercise. And you never know what you're going to get.
And I wrote the quizzes for the first couple meetings of the Priory scholars. And I always think that a good quiz is the one where you, right off the bat, know about 60 to 70% of the answers. You can work a little harder to get up to 80 or think to get to 90. But then there's a couple where they're right on the tip of your brain, but you can't quite put your finger on it. But if anything on that quiz is too obscure, if it's the list of streets that Sherlock Holmes walks down in the empty house, or the list of things that border the square in the Red-Headed League, that to me edges into the minutia where people disengage from it. And you want to, I think a good quiz is leading people on with making the answers just far enough out of reach that they want to try to remember the answers, as opposed to coming in and saying, what is the fourth word on the third page of the story? And you're like, I don't care. So once you don't care, you can check out. But it's just that little bit ahead of the quizzee that the quiz needs to stay.
I think that's a very good description. The best quizzes touch on, ask about, inquire about, capture things that are either important during the case in one way or another to Holmes or Watson, or are instrumental to the case, to the situation, to the solution. It's not really, how many collar buttons were, on Violet Hunter's right sleeve.
Right.
3.
And there is an element, I think, of that, but you have to play with the right kind of minutia. I think a great example is something like, how many forms of tobacco is Sherlock Holmes familiar with?
Right.
That is a piece of minutia, but it's a good one. Like, it's a good thing that you want to sort of like, right, I can rattle that off.
Right. Well, it's an indicator of a character, like how many languages did Mr. Melas speak? Things like that.
Exactly. That's actually another great one.
Yeah.
18.
Oh, I
forms of
I don't know.
17 and a half.
Well, it sounds like, Nick, that you picked up a little bit of your mom's traits as a school teacher. The way you described how to hold an audience, would seem to be the same way she had to grapple with holding a classroom and keeping people interested enough in the material to make it all the way through. And how do you quiz people on this kind of stuff? How do you test their knowledge? It's not about the arcana. It's really about, did you get the gist of what was intended?
Yeah, I've always thought that the best teachers are the ones that teach you how to think or how to approach new situations. One of my professors in college always said that there's 2 kinds of information: the kind of information you need to know and the kind of information you need to know where to find. And he said openly, he's like, I will never ask you a date on any of these history quizzes because you can look that up without any problem.
Right.
But what I want to know is how you synthesize all of these events together into a story, how one affects the other, how you can bring your own thinking into these situations. So it's that sort of, I almost want to say holistic, but also like 1,000-foot view that I like about the game, frankly, and I like about the approach to learning and the approach to curiosity in that sense, where it's like, I don't want to necessarily nitpick Star Trek to death, but I'm much more interested in its oversweeping themes and how does the structure work and what's this big picture in there. And then if the phaser's set on the wrong setting, I don't particularly care about that as much as what's going on in the theme.
Right. Well, sticking with the academic theme here, with your mom as your inspiration early on and your involvement with quizzes and your fine take on what makes a good quiz. Tell us about the Priory Scholars, how you first got involved with them and what kind of a group that is.
Sure. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was a lot of youngish Sherlockians in the New York area, and Judith Freeman approached me and Matt Laffey and asked us if we would be interested in joining her and helping her resurrect the Priory Scholars of NYC. That was a group that had been active in the past. It was originally founded by Chris Steinbrenner as the Priory Scholars of Fordham. And it had gone dormant, and Judith had been a part of it in the past. And with this new influx in population and this new influx in talent, she wanted to restart the Scion. So we restarted with a couple meetings with me, her, and Matt as the faculty, and Judith was the headmistress. And we had some of those meetings, and they went really well. And we realized that we were, at that point, the only Scion in Manhattan. There were ones in Brooklyn. There were ones in Jersey. But we were the only one in New York. New York proper, excuse me.
Now, what about Ash? Does that count?
Well, Ash, of course, is not a Scion of the Baker Street Irregulars. They're a alternate group or a splinter group or a partner group or something like that. But you are right. It was us and the Adventuresses. And the Adventuresses have a twice-a-year brunch, toasts and papers kind of meeting. And what we really wanted to develop was something that revolved around what we thought of it as a more traditional structure, but honestly a structure that matched our Priory Scholars kind of name. We wanted toasts and quizzes and a story discussion, everything framed around a single story. Judith had the idea to get people involved by asking them to do mini presentations that enhanced our understanding of the story. And we started calling these homework assignments. And we have somebody give us short summary of the story before we discuss it. And then we have people provide little homework assignments, which you can think of as short mini 5-minute papers about something specific in the story that helps frame our discussion or helps explain something about the story to a modern audience.
I like that.
For example, when we did the Bruce Partington plans, John Besh talked about the railroad of the time. And we just did A Scandal in Bohemia, and Jen Nealon talked about cross-dressing at the time and women and trouser rolls and things like that. So to sort of put these stories into a context for the original readers as we're having the discussion about them.
Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. So those are your homework assignments. What other schoolroom type attributes or nomenclature go along with the Priory scholars?
Well, everybody in the organization, the people who run the organization, we refer to ourselves as the faculty, and we all have faculty positions. I am the headmaster. Judith is the headmistress emerita. Chris Zordon is the finance master because he runs our treasury and talks to the venues. Rachel Klingberg is our web mistress and such things. And if you actually go to our website, the position of German master is available.
Oh. Well, let's say, hey, are you taking applications for that?
Well, considering he meets a rather unfortunate fate, we're leaving that position open at the moment.
Do you need to know how to ride a bicycle?
One hopes.
Okay. That's good.
But we won't make you do it solitarily.
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. You guys ever have detention?
No, but we've talked about doing field trips.
Aha.
We also have a school bell that we ring to start the meetings. We sing a school song at the end of it. And the whole thing we refer to our folk as fellow scholars. So the whole thing sort of gets a fake school-esque vibe. We talk about the summer session and the fall session of the Scion and things like that.
What's your school song?
The song came to us from Judith. It was a previous school song as well. And it's to the vague tune of one of those old English school songs that you feel like you know, but I can't quite cite. And Mickey Fromkin wrote some of the lyrics to it.
Are you going to treat us to a sample?
I don't have the lyrics in front of me, sadly. And the last time at Ash, I was trying to come up with them, and I am so reliant on the handouts that I'm not sure I could come up with one.
All right.
But if you ask really nicely.
Would you treat us, please?
We could always buy the CD.
Oh, hey, for 99 cents on your SoundCloud.
There you go.
Does actually, Scott, does iHost have a SoundCloud?
Yeah.
Well, then I'll make sure you get something.
Okay.
How about that?
Excellent. We'll look forward to that. And you know, if I had my druthers, it would be Gaudium Igitur, but that's a whole other kind of song. Yeah.
One of the things we try very much to do with the Scion is root it in its history, but also be moving forward as the hobby changes. So the song is one of those pieces that has come from the past and we're bringing it forward and it is a part of us now. And we have added in the homework and our summary that we ask people to do and our particular standard toasts. So we're trying to have this alchemy of keeping the memory green by moving the memory forward.
Oh, I like that. I wonder if school songs is a transatlantic phenomenon or if that's just something associated with the States. I can't remember ever hearing a song associated with an English school of any sort.
Well, I don't know. Our melody is vaguely, it's vague, you know, it's definitely an alma mater. And I don't know if I frankly don't know if it's based on anything specific, but it has that, oh, right, yeah, I know what this song is, feel to it. And it is the last thing we do. Mickey usually leads it when she's at the meetings, and it We are getting better and better at singing it.
Well, Bert, it could be like Tom Lehrer's Bright College Days. Bright college days, those carefree days that fly. To thee we sing with our glasses raised on high.
Let's give a toast as each of us recalls ivy-covered professors in ivy-covered halls.
Soon we'll be out amidst the cold world's strife. Soon we'll be sliding down the razor blade of life. Oh, well. Well, this is far too much on scholarly singing, or non-scholarly singing as it would be. We're going to take a quick break right now, let you hear from one of our sponsors. When we come back, we're going to talk with Nick all about his latest paper that was all the rage at Scintillation of Scions. You hear the word scholar an awful lot when it comes to the Baker Street Journal. Scholarly papers, Sherlockian scholarship. And if that isn't enough to sell seashells by the seashore, I don't know what is. But the BSJ is more than a dry and stuffy academic publication. When you think about it, dry and stuffy are terms that should really only be used when talking about nasal passages. But the BSJ has managed to have fun with readers and with itself over the years to lighten the burden of keeping green the memory of the master. Some examples include a review of The Hound of the Baskervilles as performed by a tap dance troupe, Sherlock Holmes in shorthand, Conan Doyle's cycling habits, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in the comics, and many, many more. And let's not forget about the regular cartoons of Scott Bond in Art in the Blood. Yes, there's a little something for everyone in the Baker Street Journal, scholarly and not. After school is out, head over to bakerstreetjournal.com and subscribe today. And we're back talking with Nick Martorelli of the Priory Scholars, ASH, BSI, and all the rest. But want to get a little more scholarly if we can, because just a couple of weeks ago, Nick gave a paper down in Maryland at the Scintillation of Scions event. Now, those of you who have listened to our show before know that we had Jacqueline Boast Morris on here to talk about Scintillation of Scions. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, got to check my records here, that was episode 107. That would do it. Episode 107. We'll have that in the show notes. So this year, Scintillation was handed over to new leadership. Karen Wilson, who also joined us on a previous show as well, talking about hip-hop Holmes, invited our guest here down to speak. And Nick, you want to tell us about the whole process by which one gets invited to speak, or one invites oneself to speak at Scintillation?
Sure. Karen reached out to me because she had been present years ago when I had given a faux scholarly paper with my tongue firmly in my cheek comparing Boba Fett to Irene Adler.
How does one go about doing that?
I had posted it on Facebook that Irene Adler is the Boba Fett of Sherlock Holmes. And Becky Robert, who was running the Gaslight Gala at the time, messaged me and said, I don't know if that was a joke or not, but would you be interested in giving that paper at a gala? And I am an actor at heart, so the best way to get me to do something is to flatter me. So I said, of course. And so I expanded what I thought was just a joke into an actual argument and presented it at the gala. It was like 2012 or so. And that was what Karen referenced when she asked if I would come talk at Scintillation. Not specifically that paper, but maybe something like that, she said. And I ultimately turned in something that was far more actually scholarly than that one, for which the world is not yet prepared.
Okay.
Now, for those of our listeners who might not know, can you explain who Boba Fett is?
Of course, Boba Fett is the bounty hunter in The Empire Strikes Back, the second Star Wars film. He is the one with the cool helmet who captures Han Solo, delivers him to Cloud City, where Han Solo is then frozen in carbonite. Boba Fett is paid handsomely for what he has done. Then he takes Han Solo off to the vile clutches of the gangster Jabba the Hutt. This is all a trap to ensnare Luke Skywalker for Darth Vader's nefarious schemes. But Boba Fett is the bounty hunter that Vader hires to trap Han and lure Luke in.
And so the leap to the world of Sherlock Holmes then?
So briefly, what I argued was that both of those characters have grown outside their original bounds, by which I mean their initial appearances in the canon, in their respective canons, are somewhat minor if you think about it as a piece of a whole, but they are somehow the thing that have taken on a life of their own outside of their initial appearance. Because Boba Fett is standing on the bridge of that Star Destroyer with 4 other bounty hunters, none of which our listeners would know. And so there is something about him that leaps out of the rest of the group. The same thing with Irene Adler, and you look at her and you think, well, why not Violet Westbury? Why not Violet Hunter? Why not anyone else in this? Why not any of these other people? But it's Irene who somehow caught something and moved forward. So the paper is a exploration of maybe what they caught.
You think about this stuff way too much.
Well, this is again that 30,000 foot view, that all inclusive view of looking at broad strokes and sweeping ideas that go across lives and across canons, not specifically looking at one story or 2 stories against each other, but like, what does the whole sweeping theme of it all tell us? What can we learn by thinking of these as stories in a sequence and not necessarily a completed thing? You know, these things come out periodically. So we were discussing Study in Scarlet at the Priory School, and I said, this is the first Sherlock Holmes story, right? Yeah. It's only the 3rd. This is the 3rd Sherlock Holmes story. Because when people read this, all they've read is the first 2 novels, Study in Scarlet and Sign of 4. This is not the 3rd of 60. This is the 3rd of 3. And then it becomes the 3rd of 4. Then it becomes the 3rd of 10. And eventually it becomes the 3rd of 60. So if we look at it in that sense, it's almost like looking at it from a fresh perspective, which was, ironically, it's an original perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
That's ingenious.
Well, it's very clever. And you know what you're doing here, you're following in some great footsteps. People like Joseph Campbell, for example, who years ago wrote Hero of a Thousand Faces, which was his very sweeping look across myth all around the world over centuries and distilling it down to commonalities that, oddly enough, to our earlier conversation, inspired George Lucas to construct the original tale of Star Wars. But also, the nice thing about it too is that it hits a theme that I really like to come back to time and time again, which is that Sherlock Holmes really is the hero of a great saga. And that these 60 stories, you know, represent from their commencement to their conclusion, a great heroic tale. So I like that a lot.
Absolutely. And of course, and we don't want to discount that, while at the same time, when we look at Study in Scarlet, we can say, well, we know nothing else about him. All that we're going to learn is going to come later. So what do we think about him right now?
Yeah. That's interesting too. You know, for all the biographies that have been written about Sherlock Holmes, I mean, your observation about that, you know, something I haven't thought of before, but for everything we know about Sherlock Holmes and for all the biographies that have been written, I don't think there are any that have really treated his evolution as a person? How was he different? What were the major phases of his life, and how was he different? Can we gather any of that? Is that a theme? Is that a construct we can make from looking at the saga or looking at his adventures?
And the thing I think that would be interesting in there is to imagine that after this celebrated detective has died so spectacularly at the Reichenbach Falls, surely opportunistic publishers would leap in there with their definitive biography of Sherlock Holmes. So what would that book feel like? What would it feel like to get his biography halfway through his life? The scandalous tell-all that comes out when he finally retires, like treating him as encountering him along the middle of his journey, as opposed to, as we do, it's all complete. It's all there. It's all finished. We have a very different perspective on someone like FDR than we do on someone like Barack Obama.
So this thinking that you brought, to Scandal in Bohemia, you also applied it for this larger paper that you just gave at Scintillation, where I'll let you explain it because I think you do a much better job of setting it up. But why don't you just share with us the concept of the story, and then we'll work through some of your premises along the way.
Of course. So the paper was called Revision, My Dear Watson. And my basic way of engaging with the four novels, this was about the four novels, and I wanted to look at them as the works of a single writer. And as all writers do, they will continue to develop the same themes, play with the same ideas, sometimes go back to things they have done before in a previous novel and work it from a slightly different angle. So if we think of these books as books, and I think we have to, we're going to give John Watson a lot of grief for not getting dates right, not getting facts right, forgetting where he was shot, forgetting what his own name is, and rightly so. But he also presents himself as a novelist. He's not saying he's a newspaperman. He's not saying these are factual accounts. And man, in fact, quite the opposite. He is openly telling us that he is going to lie to us and make stuff up and change things and make them, and Holmes accuses him of making them better stories. So we have to sort of go into them knowing that they're fiction. Now, that's not to say they never happen, but the books as they're presented are presented as books. And with this in mind, it also becomes much less important to think about who actually wrote them. Is this John Watson? Is this Arthur Conan Doyle? But if we are engaging with this idea that whoever wrote them, let's call him Arthur Conan Watson. Arthur Conan Watson is engaging with four novels over the course of his life. And he's having experiences. He's writing other things. He is going all around in the Sherlock Holmes world. But what do these four novels have that we can sort of pick apart in that sense? And what I argued in my paper at Scintillation was that each successive novel reflects a thinking on the previous one and a reworking of the previous one. That you can see when he goes to the second one, he's going to play with what he did in the first one and refine a little bit. And then he's going to get to the third. And he's going to take ideas from both of the first two and integrate them with some new ideas into the third. And by the time he gets to the fourth, I argue, the Valley of Fear is where he gets it all right. The previous three and all of the short stories have led to this moment when he actually sort of engages and fully solves the problem of how to write a Sherlock Holmes novel. Well, how to get it into a novel.
What do you make of stories 1, 2, and 4? That's Study in Scarlet, The Sign of Four, The Valley of Fear, all having a separate section that is a very long flashback versus The Hound of the Baskervilles really having a flashback early on, but just, kind of summing up the curse. It really involves no action of any of our main characters. How do you account for that smack dab in the middle of this quartet?
So what I think accounts for that is that in the intervening time, he has written the short stories. So the first two novels are part one, Holmes, part 2, flashback-ish. And then he then writes a series of short stories that are all far shorter. He's not worrying about throwing in this backstory. He doesn't have to sort of integrate it in. And so when he gets to The Hound of the Baskervilles, it of course has no clear distinction between the sections. But what we also get in here is that for the first time, the extra adventure, so to speak, like the lengthening that goes to the novel, that extra adventure is letters and journal entries explicitly in the text. This is not I wrote all this up later of A Study in Scarlet, nor is it the outright dialogue of Sign of Four. This is Watson saying, well, I can't do any better than quote my journal, so here it is. I can't do any better than copy out the letter I sent to Holmes, so here it is. So this is the first time where that extra content is one of our leads. Watson is the one who has his own part 2 in this story.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if he has another adventure. This other expansion now is not a flashback. It's not backstory. It's its own story all by itself. Watson is off investigating the crime, moving the plot forward, and he's doing his own thing. And I think that's some of the influence of the short stories that he's now written sort of coming in. And of course, at the end of Hound, we still have the same conclusion. We still have that chapter where Holmes sits back in the basket chair and explains everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the bit where we would, in a previous novel, have gotten, it's easy to imagine Stapleton's statement of the case. And we are now listening to Stapleton being interrogated. Or we are reading the letters that Beryl has written to Holmes. But Holmes says, well, I talked to her and I've got it all. But it's keeping us with the heroes, as opposed to sending us away somewhere else.
What works particularly well in the Valley of Fear, where we can see Arthur Conan Watson, as you call him, has reached the apex of his Sherlock Holmes writing career?
So for me, what Valley of Fear does is it brings in elements of the first 3, but also proceeds to iterate them and move them a little bit forward. There is a part 2. And that part 2 has entirely new characters, entirely new setting. It's a totally different plot from part 1. And that is A Study in Scarlet. It's also overtly presented to the listener. And I think this is the influence from Sign of Four. Because right before we go into the second half of Valley of Fear, there's that passage where Watson turns to the reader essentially and specifically says, like, I'm going to ask you to come with me to another story. I'm going to tell you more. And it's going to be singular and terrible. But then he says, don't think that I'm telling you a different story. We're going to come back to this one. Trust me on this. Like, this story is not done yet. This is a little break. And we'll be back to Baker Street. And that is a little Sign of Four-y, but it's also a little iterative now moving forward, where Watson is saying, come away with me, trust me. These stories connect. It's the first time he promises that the backstory is integral and connected as opposed to just also there. And then, of course, it's also not really a true backstory of the crime in the same way that the first 2 are. The first 2 are, we learn why the murderer has committed the murders that the murderer has committed. So the heroes of those first 2 novels' backstories are the criminal. But what we get in Valley of Fear is another identity mystery. There's another mystery at the heart of part 2. The first one has gone on who is the murderer, and the second one says, no, wait, who was murdered? So it's not the backstory as to why the murderer did the things the murderer did. And that, to me, is the iteration of The Hound of the Baskervilles. We're now giving you a separate story. This story stands on its own, apart from what we've already gotten. This is not the footnote as to why the killer did it. This is a whole other adventure that we're having with another detective and another crime and another sort of life that he's living. And that is very Hound. That is also very Study in Scarlet. But what we've done now is explicitly connect them. and Watson is saying, this story connects, as opposed to Study in Scarlet, where suddenly you're in America and there's not really any transition there.
Yeah, you know, just the other day, I saw someone going over a number of mystery fiction or detective fiction authors in some piece. And they finally wound their way back to Conan Doyle. And they said, you know, when you look at what he did, which was ingenious, you know, he was a money-making machine, first of all. And he learned how to do effectively a serial, but a serial on main characters rather than on a single plot line. And, you know, as I've coached companies and talked to audiences about storytelling, I said there's really two kinds of serials that you can do. One is the story arc, and the other is centered around characters that are interesting enough to follow along from story to story, but each story can stand on its own. And that's the Law and Order model. You know, and someone said Conan Doyle invented the police procedural. Mm-hmm. And when you think about how each Law and Order story opens, there's some backstory there, whether it's the murder or whether it's something that's going on in someone's life. And then by the end of the show, it's all woven together in some way. And the way you just described the Valley of Fear, it sounds like a much more modern police procedural than anything we had been exposed to earlier on in the other stories.
And I've also been in conversations talking about the Valley of Fear as a proto-noir novel. That second half of it has a lot of flavor that would then be refined by other authors into the next stage of detective fiction. Like this is now a hard-boiled detective who's getting into fist fights and scrapes. You know, it's like, as much as we think of Sherlock Holmes as being fist fights and gunfire, there's very little of that in there. He is the gentleman consulting room detective. It's going to be Philip Marlowe that is the gunfighter and the brawler. But with McMurdo and his story, I think we're sort of venturing forward in that way. We're Conan Doyle, I think, is at that point looking at what is coming.
Mm. Well, I think, you know, your description of the structural elements of the Valley of Fear and your overall premise, which is that these novels looked at in sequence point to a maturation in technique on the part of Watson, let's say, makes a lot of sense. The Valley of Fear has always been my favorite of the Holmes novels, even above The Hound of the Baskervilles, only because it's always seemed to me that the writer, I mean, let's say, go back to the sake of argument and talk about Conan Doyle. This is really Conan Doyle at the top of his game. You know, he's written so much, and all you need to get a sense of it is to look at the first 1,000 words. I mean, this is a novel, you know, Conan Doyle has so many hallmarks, and you've talked about some of them. One of them is that like P.G. Wodehouse, he was focused on writing just the good parts. So his stories always start on action or start in with as few words as possible that just put you right in the action. And his preference is always to start on dialogue. So the Valley of Fear starts with, "I am inclined to think," said I should do so," Sherlock Holmes remarked impatiently. I mean, bang! You know, you were right there with our hero narrator making a comment to his grumpy friend. And off you go. You know, I believe I am one of the most long-suffering of mortals, but I'll admit I was annoyed at that interruption. Really, Holmes, you were a little trying at times. And bang, we're right into Porlock. Well, who is Porlock? Oh, you know, you've heard me, says Holmes, speak of Professor Moriarty, the famous scientific criminal, Watson says, is famous among crooks as, oh, my blushes. Watson, Holmes murmured in a deprecating voice. I was about to say, as he is unknown to the public. So just look what's going on, you know, in the first 2 minutes of the story. And then, you know, you're into the cipher challenge. And a lot of exposition around how we could figure out what it says. And at the end of this whole first chapter, what do we have? Holmes and Watson have pulled out the names Douglas and Burlstone because those couldn't be coded into the cipher. And in comes the inspector who says, "Oh, Mr. Holmes, Mr. Douglas of Burlstone Manor House was horribly murdered last night." Bum, bum, bum.
And compare that, Bert, to the beginning of A Study in Scarlet that takes us a chapter of learning who Watson is, a chapter of learning who Holmes is, and then a chapter of Watson not knowing what Holmes does. The clients are there, but Watson's not meeting them until that commissionaire comes in and they're talking about the Book of Life article. And that's 4 chapters in. Yeah. And if we go forward from Valley of Fear, we meet Miss Wonderly on page 3 of the Maltese Falcon. Like, we are right there. We're starting. We're ready. Here we go. Let's happen.
Well, but at this point, the author here, go back to Watson, has had the benefit of writing and preparing for print and seeing in print and getting published stories, and surely knows what captures his readers. So he's just dropped all the unnecessary things. And I tell you, a very interesting exercise. It would be an interesting exercise to take any chapter of the Valley of Fear and try to cut things out of it.
Like punctuation?
It's
attributions.
You can't really cut a scene. You can't really trim the dialogue. There aren't even any extra adjectives. It's, it passes a lot of tests.
I think something you just referred to, Bert, is one of the ways I like looking at the novels in this way, because you were going back and forth between Arthur Conan Doyle and Dr. Watson. But if we're going to look at it, and that's actually why I started saying Arthur Conan Watson, because if we're going to look at these as products of a writer, it doesn't really matter which one of those the writer is. We can still talk about his Sherlock Holmes stories, whoever the author happens to be.
Yeah, exactly.
It's valuable to separate them when we want to make that separation. And then when we want to conflate them, I think it's useful to say, no, we're talking about the same thing. Watson is not a newspaperman, and he never says he is.
Well, but no, I think that's exactly right. And it's part of the charm and fun of what we do playing this game, which is that our definition of Watson and his limits is very flexible. Sometimes when it suits us, we say, well, his handwriting really wasn't very good, and he probably forgot this, and there must be a reason why he wrote down his wife calling him by a name other than his own, and he was a little absent-minded. But on the other hand, just think about it. Let's take the example of Valley of Fear again and say that all of these remarkable events, the unraveling of this strange case, the looming presence of Professor Moriarty, you as Watson are thinking about putting it down as a novel and making some money and continuing to publish and promote the cases of Sherlock Holmes. You pick up your pencil and you say to yourself, where do I begin? How am I going to start? I guess I know. I'll start with that day in Baker Street when, we first got that message from Porlock. And, if you do that and think about that, you're adding quite a level of skill and dexterity and talent to, the great chronicler of these cases.
It all began that one day when I was sitting around Baker Street waiting for the telegram to show up.
Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, telegram here, sir.
John H. Watson, newspaperman. So, what's your next project, Nick?
Oh, man. We have a Priory meeting coming up in July and then another one in October. We do 3 meetings a year. I am writing a chapter for an upcoming BSI book about soldiers in the canon, soldiers in the military. Think that's it. Sherlockian wise.
You have plenty of free time.
Am I forgetting something?
Where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
People can find me on Twitter. I am at Nick Martorelli.
Well, that's easy enough. And the Priory Scholars, Facebook, Twitter, etc.?
Yep, we are on Facebook. We have a Twitter at Priory NYC. And you can also reach us via email at priorynyc@gmail.com.
Excellent.
Oh, very good. And professionally, we haven't talked at all about the fact that you are a producer of audiobooks for a not too shabby corporation. Is there any likelihood that you may dramatize or produce something Sherlockian in the future?
I actually do have a Sherlockian audiobook coming out. I produced a book called Conan Doyle for the Defense by Margaret Fox. She's a New York Times writer, and this is a nonfiction account of Arthur Conan Doyle's investigation into the Oscar Slater murder. Well, the murder for which Oscar Slater was accused. And it comes out at the end of June.
Oh, and who's the voice artist for that?
Voice artist is a Scottish actor named Peter Forbes.
Excellent. We'll look forward to that. Well, Nick, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. We wish you lots of luck in everything that's coming up, and we hope to see you around these parts again.
Thank you so much, guys. I would love to come back. Thank you for having me.
Well, it was delightful to have Nick actually in front of the microphone instead of just as our resident quizmaster, which we never talked about. We said we were going to get to that later in the show, and we got onto so many other topics with him. We didn't talk about Nick being the moving force behind some of our quizzes in earlier episodes.
Oh, that's right.
Well,
and those were great quizzes. Those predate the canonical couplets, which we're now doing.
Yes. That was the listener call-in version, which, just as a note, as a producer, it was a heck of a lot more difficult to schedule those than it was to simply go with the canonical couplet. So we're grateful to Nick for his service, but we needed a full-time scheduler.
Yeah. But it was a great conversation with Nick, and there you've got a great profile of someone who, it's a great example, for those who are listening who are thinking about, I want to do a bit more of some of this. Here's Nick, who, based on that early experience discovering Sherlock Holmes, is now engaged in a scion, has been engaged in other things, but also is just leveraging just a lot of his natural interest into exploring the cases of Sherlock Holmes in really interesting ways.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, are you heading to that Priory Scholars meeting?
No, I'm not going to be able to be. It's in July. I think there's a reason why, and we've got some other commitment for that weekend. But I am going to the epilogues of Sherlock Holmes this coming weekend.
Oh, that's
Nick
okay.
is rumored that he's coming.
Excellent. Well, there's always something to do in the Northeast area of the United States with regard to Sherlockians. It's a veritable hotbed of activity. We should also remind folks, if you haven't been listening lately, or if you haven't been tuning into our Facebook page, we have been sharing information about Holmes in the Heartland. And of course, you may remember that we had Rob Nunn on here to talk about the criminal mastermind of Baker Street in episode 142. Rob is also one of the organizers behind Holmes in the Heartland, taking place in early August down in St. Louis. We'll have a link to the event in the show notes, so you can check that out. It sounds like a really amazing time. And really, what other Sherlockian event are you going to get authentic barbecue at? Well, This is barbecue for the mind rather than barbecue for the stomach. It is, of course, canonical couplets to which I refer. Yes, it's the quiz show that you've come to know and love here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we give you two simple lines in rhyming form, and you need to figure out which canonical story they refer to. If you recall, our last canonical couplet that we gave on episode 145 went like this. Some strange proceedings occupied the night. The colors were distinctly green and white. Bert, do you know which story that referred to?
Yes, I do, but I'm prevented from previous non-disclosure agreements from telling you.
I love the way you handled that. Well, I can gladly fill in because I've received the waiver. It is the adventure of Wisteria Lodge.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And we had a whole bunch of folks who were good enough to send in their responses. And we need to spin the random number generator barrel until we come up with one of their names. And it lands on... Oh, looks like it lands on number 32, and that corresponds with... Why, it corresponds with Kitty Kong. Kitty, thank you for that winning entry. We will be in touch with you and tell you how you claim your prize. Well, if you're interested in playing this time around, here it comes. The canonical couplet for episode 146 goes like this. When noble dukes such doubtful aims pursue, they cause a mercenary point of view. Ah, tricky one there. If you think you know the answer to this canonical couplet, send an email to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. We will choose from all the correct entries randomly to see who the winner will be on episode 147. Thanks for playing, and good luck.
Boy, that was great. I always have trouble, though, when we come up with things that reference dukes. I can't remember if we're talking about Patty or her sister.
Yeah, they were cousins. Identical
right.
cousins. I don't know how you get an identical cousin.
I think it's got to do with central casting, I think.
Either central casting or somebody was a stand-in parent. What do you call it? A surrogate. I don't know. Something was going on in that family that wasn't right. I don't know. Well, anyway, going on here in our Sherlockian family, it's always right when you're with us. And we are looking forward to having you with us again at the end of the month when 147 comes up. Who will our mystery guest be?
Ooh.
Well, it's a mystery. That's kind of why we call him a mystery guest. No mystery in that. Until then, the mystery here is that I will still remain Scout Monty.
And I am trapped in being Burt Wolder.
Come back, come back, come back.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
Between you and me, well, I guess, all right, never mind. Between the three of us.
Yes.
I was having a discussion at Ash about what the tune to this song should be. Because it's a little general. is a little general, and I am dying to find the 60s sitcom theme to which it fits. Like we'd sing the Gilligan's Island theme or something. I am dying to find that. Or it's like, what are you guys singing? Is that set to the music of the A-Team? No, absolutely not. Don't ask.
Well, you've got to get the Star Trek theme. You know, must know the story about that. Roddenberry wrote lyrics to it.
That's right.
Solely so he could get the residual.
Beyond the rim of the starlight.
That's right. We smoke 1,000 cigars.
Star Wars, nothing